The Ghost Train of Midnight. Pass welcome to midnight. Scary tales. Every town has its secrets, but not every secret is whispered about in hushed tones by those who claim to have seen it firsthand. Midnight Pass was no different. A small, forgotten town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Its name was seldom mentioned in travel guides, and its population seemed to dwindle with each passing year. Yet, those who dared to linger in the area knew of the legend, a phantom train that roared through the valley every midnight, its ghostly whistle slicing through the silence like a scream in the dark. The story was the stuff of nightmares, but few took it seriously. A ghost train. It sounded absurd, but for those who dared to wait by the old tracks as the clock struck 12, the experience was far from laughable. Some returned pale and shaking, whispering tales of glowing lights and spectral figures. Others never came back at all. This is the story of 4 friends who decided to uncover the truth behind the ghost train of Midnight Pass. They thought it would be a thrilling adventure, a fun way to spend a weekend. They couldn't have been more wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon. Main story. It all started on a chilly December evening when the group, David, Sarah, Emma, and Jake, huddled around a bonfire in Jake's backyard. Snow flurries danced in the air, and the sky was an endless expanse of stars. David had just returned from college for the holidays and was eager to catch up with his old friends. Conversation flowed easily, but as the night wore on, the group found themselves swapping ghost stories. "That's nothing," Jake said, shaking his head after Sarah recounted a particularly eerie tale about a haunted house. "You guys ever hear about the ghost train of Midnight Pass?" Emma rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. That's just an urban legend. Everyone around here has heard about it, but no one actually believes it." Jake smirked. "Believe it or not, I've seen it." The group fell silent. Even Sarah, who was the biggest skeptic of the bunch, leaned in slightly, intrigued despite herself. "You're lying," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jake shook his head. "I'm serious. It was a few years ago. I was out late, coming back from a party. My car broke down near the old tracks and I had to walk to town. Done. That's when I heard it. The whistle. At first I thought it was just a regular train, but then I saw it. The whole thing was glowing, and I swear I could see faces in the windows. Faces of people who weren't alive." A chill ran through the group, and even the crackling fire seemed to dim for a moment. "Why don't we check it out?" Sarah suggested, her tone challenging. "If it's just an urban legend, we'll have a good laugh. If it's real, well, it'll make one hell of a story." David and Emma hesitated, but Jake's enthusiasm was infectious. "Fine," David finally said. "But if this turns out to be some lame prank, I'm never letting you live it down." The next night, armed with flashlights, snacks, and an old Polaroid camera Jake had dug out of his attic, the group set off for the tracks. Midnight Pass was a quiet town, and the streets were deserted as they made their way toward the outskirts. The abandoned railway tracks lay at the edge of the forest, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by dense trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. As they approached, the temperature seemed to drop. Sarah shivered and zipped up her coat. "Is it just me or is it colder here?" Jake shrugged. "Maybe the ghosts are welcoming us." "Not funny," Emma muttered, clutching her flashlight tightly. They reached the tracks around 11:30 p.m. and set up camp on a small clearing nearby. The moonlight cast eerie shadows through the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl was the only sound breaking the silence. "All right," Jake said, pulling out his camera. "If this train shows up, I'm getting proof." They waited, the minutes ticking by agonizingly slowly. Sarah tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but her laughter sounded forced. David kept checking his watch, growing increasingly impatient. At exactly 11:59 p.m., the atmosphere changed. The wind picked up, rustling the trees violently. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and an unnatural stillness settled over the group. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. At first it was faint, a distant, rhythmic clattering like wheels on metal. Then came the whistle, high-pitched and mournful, cutting through the night like a blade. Jake stood up, his camera at the ready. "It's coming," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear. A light appeared in the distance, growing brighter with each passing second. The group stared in stunned silence as the train emerged from the darkness, its carriages glowing with an unearthly light. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The train looked ancient, its once polished metal now rusted and worn. But what caught their attention were the passengers. Through the foggy windows, they could see faces, pale, hollow-eyed faces that seemed to be staring directly at them. "Take a picture," Sarah hissed, nudging Jake. He raised the camera and snapped several shots, the flash illuminating the eerie scene. The train slowed as it approached the group, its wheels screeching against the tracks. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The doors creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. "Is this a joke?" David asked, his voice shaking. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "I don't think so." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah stepped forward, drawn to the train as if in a trance. "Sarah, don't!" Emma shouted, but it was too late. Sarah disappeared into the darkness, and the doors slammed shut behind her. The train whistle blew again, louder and more piercing this time. The remaining three friends could only watch in horror as the train began to move, picking up speed until it disappeared into the night, taking Sarah with it. Emma collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. What just happened? Where did it take her? Jake looked at the tracks, now empty and silent. "We have to get her back," he said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "How?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That thing isn't natural. How are we supposed to fight something like that?" Jake didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear. They couldn't leave Sarah to face the ghost train alone. The hours after Sarah's disappearance were a blur. Emma sobbed quietly as David and Jake tried to process what had happened. No one dared to speak as they stumbled back to Jake's house, their flashlights barely illuminating the path. When they finally sat down at the kitchen table, the gravity of the situation hit them like a freight train. This can't be real," Emma said, her voice shaking. "Ghost trains don't exist. They just don't." Jake slammed his fist on the table, startling both of them. "We all saw it, Emma. It's real. And Sarah, she's out there somewhere. We can't just sit here and do nothing." David looked at Jake, his face pale but determined. "How do we even begin? That thing isn't just a train. It's something else entirely. And if it's taken Sarah, what does it want with her?" Jake pulled out his laptop and opened a search engine. "There has to be something," he muttered, typing feverishly. "Stories, legends, anything about Midnight Pass and this train." Hours passed as they combed through forums, old newspaper archives, and obscure blogs. Finally, Jake found something, a thread on an old paranormal website. The post was from over a decade ago, written by someone who claimed to have encountered the ghost train and lived to tell the tale. The legend of the ghost train. According to the post, the train was said to be cursed, bound to the tracks after a tragic accident in the late 1800s. A wealthy railroad tycoon had been aboard the train during its final journey, accompanied by his family and servants. The tycoon, obsessed with punctuality, had ordered the engineer to maintain the schedule at all costs, even as a blizzard descended upon the valley. The train derailed on a sharp turn, plunging into the icy river below. Everyone on board perished, but the tycoon's spirit was said to have been so consumed by guilt that he refused to move on. Now, the train roams the tracks every midnight, collecting souls to accompany him on his eternal journey. "Here," Jake said, pointing to the screen. "The person who wrote this says they escaped by leaving an offering on the tracks. Something personal. something meaningful. They claim the train stopped and the doors opened, but they resisted the pull to board. Emma frowned. But Sarah didn't leave anything behind. And she got on the train. Jake's jaw tightened. Then we're going to have to do more than leave an offering. We're going to have to find a way onto that train ourselves. Preparing for the next midnight. The trio spent the rest of the day gathering supplies. Flashlights, ropes, tools, and a notebook filled with hastily scribbled plans. Jake insisted on bringing the Polaroid camera, though the thought of taking pictures of the train again sent shivers down their spines. As midnight approached, the tension in the air was palpable. They returned to the tracks, the snow crunching under their boots. The clearing looked the same as it had the night before, but the weight of what had happened made it feel colder, darker. "Are we sure about this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded. "We don't have a choice. If we don't try, Sarah is gone forever." Emma swallowed hard. "All right, let's do this." The train returns. As the clock struck 12, the now familiar whistle pierced the night. The wind picked up and the heavy, suffocating air returned. Lights appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the train roared toward them. The train screeched to a halt, its glowing carriages casting an eerie light over the clearing. The doors opened, and the trio felt the same unnatural pull that had lured Sarah aboard. "Stay close," Jake said, gripping the rope they had tied around each other's waists. "Whatever happens, we don't let go." They stepped onto the train, their breath visible in the frigid air. The interior was dimly lit, with flickering lanterns casting long, distorted shadows. The seats were filled with passengers, ghostly figures with hollow eyes and pale, translucent skin. Some turned to look at them, their expressions unreadable. "I don't like this," Emma whispered, her hand clutching David's arm. "Just keep moving," Jake said, his voice strained. They made their way through the carriages, each one more haunting than the last. Some passengers stared out of broken windows, while others seemed to whisper to themselves in languages the trio couldn't understand. Finally, they reached the last carriage. It was empty, save for a single figure sitting at the far end. "Sarah!" Emma cried, rushing forward. Sarah turned to look at them, but something was wrong. Her eyes were vacant, and her skin had taken on the same translucent quality as the other passengers. "Sarah, it's us," Jake said, approaching cautiously. "We're here to bring you back." Sarah blinked slowly, as if trying to process his words. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice hollow. "He won't let you leave." "Who?" David asked, his voice trembling. Before Sarah could answer, the door to the carriage slammed shut, and the train began to move. The tycoon's warning. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered violently. A figure appeared at the front of the carriage, a tall man in an old-fashioned suit, his face shrouded in shadows. "You have no place here," the man said, his voice deep and resonant. "This is my domain." "We're not leaving without her," Jake said, stepping forward. The man laughed, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "You cannot take what belongs to me. She boarded willingly. Her fate is sealed." Emma clutched Sarah's hand. "We'll find a way to free you," she whispered. The man stepped closer, his presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "If you wish to challenge me, then prepare to pay the price." The train picked up speed, the walls shaking violently. The trio huddled together, their determination wavering as the tycoon's shadow loomed over them. The tycoon's game. The air in the carriage grew heavier, almost suffocating. The tycoon loomed over them, his shadow stretching across the dimly lit space. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You dare defy me?" he said, his tone a mix of fury and amusement. "You do not understand the forces at play here. This train collects the lost, the broken, and the damned. It offers solace to those who seek it. Your friend, She chose to board. "That's not true!" Emma shouted, stepping forward. Her voice shook, but her resolve was firm. "She didn't know what she was doing. You tricked her." The tycoon laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to shake the walls of the train. "The choice was hers, whether you believe it or not. But since you are so determined to challenge me, let us play a game." Before they could respond, the train shifted violently. The walls of the carriage dissolved, replaced by a vast, swirling void of darkness. The trio found themselves standing on a narrow, crumbling bridge suspended in the abyss. The tycoon hovered before them, his form growing larger and more menacing. The trial of courage. "The rules are simple," the tycoon said, his voice booming. "If you wish to save your friend, you must face 3 trials. Succeed, and I will release her. Fail, and you will all remain on this train forever." David, Jake, and Emma exchanged nervous glances. There was no other option. "What's the first trial?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The tycoon raised a hand, and the bridge beneath them shifted, splitting into 3 separate paths. "Courage," he said. "Each of you must walk your own path and face what lies ahead. Only the brave may proceed." Before they could protest, the paths stretched farther apart, separating the trio. Each found themselves alone, the void pressing in on all sides. David's path led him to a room filled with mirrors. As he stepped inside, his reflection multiplied, surrounding him on all sides. But the reflections weren't normal. They moved on their own, their eyes filled with malice. "You think you're strong enough to save her?" One of the reflections sneered. "You couldn't even save yourself." David clenched his fists, refusing to let the reflections get to him. "You're not real," he said, his voice firm. "You're just a trick." The reflections laughed, their voices echoing eerily. "Are we?" One by one, they stepped out of the mirrors, surrounding David. He braced himself, knowing he had to fight, both them and his own doubts, if he wanted to make it through. Emma's path. Emma found herself in a forest shrouded in fog. The trees seemed to whisper her name, their branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. "Emma," a voice called, faint and haunting. She recognized it immediately. It was her brother's voice. He had died years ago in a car accident, a loss she had never fully come to terms with. "Emma, why didn't you save me?" the voice said, closer now. Tears streamed down her face as she stumbled through the forest, searching for the source of the voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I tried so hard." A figure emerged from the fog and Emma froze. It was her brother, or at least something that looked like him. His eyes were hollow, his expression accusing. "You can't save her, Emma," he said. "You couldn't save me. Just give up." "No," Emma shouted, her voice breaking. "I won't give up. Not on her, not on anyone." The forest dissolved around her, and she found herself back on the bridge, trembling but determined. Jake's path. Jake's path led him to a dark, endless corridor. Faint whispers echoed around him, growing louder with each step. "Failure," the voices said. "You've always been a failure." Jake gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. The whispers turned into screams, each one a reminder of every mistake he had ever made, every time he had let someone down. "I'm not a failure," he muttered, his voice shaking. "I'm not." The corridor began to collapse, the walls closing in. Jake broke into a run, his fear threatening to consume him. But then he remembered Sarah, her laugh, her smile, the way she had always believed in him. "I won't let you down," he said, his voice stronger now. "Not this time." The corridor disappeared, and Jake reappeared on the bridge, joining Emma. The final confrontation. David appeared moments later, battered but alive. The trio stood together facing the tycoon, who watched them with a mix of anger and admiration. You have passed the trial of courage, he said, but there are still 2 more trials to face. Bring it on, Jake said, stepping forward. The tycoon smirked, raising his hand. The void shifted again, revealing the next trial, a labyrinth filled with shadows and echoes. This is the trial of trust, the tycoon said. Let's see how strong your bond truly is. The trial of trust. The tycoon's mocking voice echoed as the trio entered the labyrinth. Trust is a fragile thing, he said. Can you depend on one another even when doubt creeps in? The labyrinth was a dark, twisting network of narrow passages lit only by flickering lanterns. Shadows darted across the walls, whispering incomprehensible words that gnawed at their minds. As they progressed, they came upon a fork in the path with 3 doors, each marked with a symbol, a key, a flame, and an eye. We need to choose wisely, Emma said, studying the symbols. I think these represent different challenges. David nodded. We'll have to split up again. No, Jake said firmly. We stay together. That's the only way we'll get through this. The shadows on the walls began to writhe, forming ghostly figures. They whispered doubts into their ears, trying to sow discord. Are you sure about that? One of the shadows hissed. Can you really trust them not to fail you? Jake clenched his fists. Yes, I trust them. He pushed open the door marked with the flame, and the group stepped through together. The Chamber of the Flame. The trio found themselves in a cavernous room filled with roaring fires. In the center of the room was a massive hourglass, its sand running dangerously low. A voice boomed from above. To pass this trial, you must extinguish the flames before the sand runs out. But beware, each flame represents a memory. Extinguish the wrong one, and you may lose something you can never get back. The flames flickered and danced, each one showing glimpses of memories. Sarah laughing during a camping trip, the trio celebrating Jake's birthday, David comforting Emma after a tough day. Emma hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. What if we lose something important? David placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure it out together. Jake examined the hourglass. We don't have much time. Let's start with the flames that show Sarah. She's the reason we're here. They worked quickly, using the tools scattered around the room to extinguish the flames. Each time they snuffed out a flame showing Sarah, the room grew darker, and the hourglass slowed. When the final flame was extinguished, the cavern trembled and the hourglass shattered. The tycoon's voice echoed through the room. Impressive. You have passed the trial of trust, but there is one more trial to face. The trial of sacrifice. The labyrinth dissolved, and the trio found themselves back on the ghost train, standing in a grand, opulent dining car. Sarah sat at the head of the table, her face pale and her eyes vacant. The tycoon stood behind her, his shadow stretching across the room. The final trial is simple, he said. One of you must stay behind. Offer yourself in her place, and she will be free. The trio froze, the weight of his words sinking in. No, David said firmly. There has to be another way. There isn't, the tycoon replied. Every soul on this train was claimed through sacrifice. One life for another. That is the price. Emma stepped forward, her voice trembling. I'll do it. Sarah has her whole life ahead of her. I can... No, Jake interrupted. We came here together and we'll leave together. There has to be another way. The tycoon smirked, clearly enjoying their torment. Time is running out. Decide, or I will claim all of you. The power of unity. In that moment, David remembered something Sarah had said during their last camping trip. The bond we share is stronger than anything else. As long as we stick together, nothing can break us. He turned to Emma and Jake. He thrives on division and fear, but we've already proven we can face anything as long as we trust each other. Let's face him together. The trio joined hands and stepped forward, confronting the tycoon. We refuse to play your game, David said. If you want us, You'll have to take us all. But we're not leaving without Sarah." The tycoon's smirk faded, replaced by a look of anger and, for the first time, fear. The room began to shake, and the shadows writhed in agony. "No!" the tycoon roared. "You cannot defy me!" But the trio's unity created a blinding light that consumed the dining car. The tycoon screamed as he dissolved into nothingness. When the light faded, the train was gone. David, Emma, Jake, and Sarah stood on the tracks, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. They walked back to their campsite in silence, the weight of the night's events settling over them. They never spoke of the ghost train again, but the bond they shared grew stronger, forged in the fires of courage, trust, and sacrifice. For Sarah, the experience was a second chance, a reminder to cherish life and the people she loved. For David, Emma, and Jake, it was proof that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, the light of friendship and unity could prevail. Have your own terrifying tale to share? Submit it to us at ak3717507@gmail.com, and we might feature it in our next story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales.